My son-in-law was screaming and cursing outside my door. I had just changed the locks on my house. A few minutes later my daughter showed up with a crowbar, furious. But what happened next left them both completely speechless. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The house settled around me with the quiet, familiar groans of old age. It was a sound I had come to cherish in the years since my husband Michael had passed. This grand old Philadelphia brownstone wasn't just a structure of brick and mortar. It was a repository of our life together, its walls saturated with 40 years of laughter, arguments, and the quiet, companionable silence of a long and loving marriage. In the profound, echoing quiet of my widowhood, I had expected the house to be my sanctuary. Instead, it had become a contested territory. My daughter Angela and her husband Damon had moved in 6 months ago. The pretext was a noble one, a performance of filial duty that had fooled everyone, including for a time, myself. "You shouldn't be alone in this big old house, Mom," Angela had insisted, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of loving concern. "We'll come and stay, just for a little while, to keep you company, to take care of things." A year later, the little while had become a permanent occupation. They were not my companions, they were my tenants, and I was the ghost who haunted the property. I, Patricia, a woman who had successfully managed a sprawling, chaotic high school for 30 years, a retired principal who could quell a cafeteria riot with a single well-aimed glare, was now a guest in my own home. Their presence was a slow, creeping invasion. It began with small things. Angela's sleek, minimalist, and profoundly uncomfortable furniture began to appear in the living room, a stark white and chrome aesthetic that was a constant jarring argument with the warm, classic elegance of my own cherished antiques. My husband's favorite worn velvet armchair was relegated to a dark corner, replaced by a thing that looked like a geometric experiment gone wrong. Then came the sound. My quiet mornings of classical music and coffee were now shattered by the thumping bass of Damon's workout playlist, or by Angela's loud performative conference calls. She was a brand strategist, she called herself, a job that seemed to consist entirely of speaking in a jargon-filled, authoritative tone to people on a speakerphone. They had taken over the main living areas with the thoughtless, all-consuming confidence of a conquering army. The second floor, where Michael and I had raised our daughter, was now their private domain. I had retreated to the first-floor suite that had once been reserved for guests, a small, self-contained world of my own bedroom, a small sitting area, and a bathroom. It was a comfortable enough space, but it was in essence a cage. A gilded, well-appointed cage, but a cage nonetheless. I tried to be accommodating. I told myself it was an adjustment, a new phase of life. I was a mother after all, and a mother's job is to provide, to nurture, to make space. But the space they were taking was not just physical, it was emotional, it was psychic. They treated me not as the matriarch of the family, not as the owner of the very roof over their heads, but as a slightly dotty and increasingly inconvenient staff member. "Mom, can you grab the mail?" "Mom, the dishwasher needs to be emptied." "Mom, could you be a dear and just tidy up the living room before our friends come over?" The requests were always framed with a veneer of politeness, but they were not requests, they were orders. Damon was the more overtly dismissive of the two. He was a man who moved through the world with the easy, unearned confidence of a handsome man who has always gotten his way. He called himself a real estate developer, but in the year he had lived under my roof, I had yet to see him develop anything but a startlingly proficient golf swing. He treated me with a kind of patronizing, affectionate contempt, calling me Patsy, a nickname I despised, and ruffling my hair as if I were a small, amusing child. Angela was more subtle, her cruelty a finer, sharper thing. She would compliment my cooking while scraping half of it into the bin. She would ask for my opinion on a new piece of art she had bought, and then hang it in a way that completely ignored my suggestion. She was engaged in a quiet, relentless campaign to erase me, to render my presence, my taste, and my very history in this house irrelevant. This evening was a perfect example. I was in the kitchen preparing a simple meal for myself, when they came in dressed for a night out. Angela was in a sharp black dress that looked like it cost a fortune. Damon was in a tailored suit, his face beaming with a salesman's charm. "Don't wait up for us, Patsy," he said, kissing the air near my cheek. "We're wining and dining some potential investors." "That's lovely, dear," I said. "Where are you going?" "Oh, just a little place downtown," Angela said, her voice a dismissive, airy wave of her hand. "You wouldn't have heard of it." The little place I knew was a new ridiculously expensive French restaurant that I had read a glowing review of in the paper just that morning. The condescension in her tone was a small, sharp, and entirely unnecessary twist of the knife. I was just the cook, the maid, the quiet old woman who lived in the back room. My world in their minds was a small provincial place, a world that did not include fine dining or the exciting important lives they were leading. The fact that my provincial life was the one that was quietly and visibly funding their own was an irony that was entirely lost on them. As they walked out the door, their laughter echoing in the grand hallway, I felt a familiar, profound, and weary sense of erasure. I was a ghost, and the house was no longer mine. A few days after their investor dinner, a sense of quiet, almost eerie peace settled over the house. Angela and Damon had gone on a business trip, a last-minute week-long excursion to Miami that had, I was sure, more to do with the Art Basel Festival than with any actual business. For the first time in months, the house was mine again. The silence was a balm, a beautiful restorative luxury. I played my classical music, I sat in my husband's armchair, I reclaimed my home, one quiet, peaceful room at a time. It was during this week of blessed solitude that I decided to finally tackle a long overdue project: sorting through the boxes in the attic. The attic was our home's memory bank, a dusty, dimly lit repository of a lifetime of accumulated belongings. There were boxes of my own childhood books, of Michael's old college textbooks, of Angela's outgrown clothes. It was a place I had been avoiding since Michael's passing, a place too saturated with the ghosts of our shared past. But now, in the newfound quiet of the house, I felt a sense of strength, of a readiness to finally confront those ghosts. I was looking for one thing in particular: the old, leather-bound photo albums from our early years of marriage. I wanted to see our faces, young and full of a hope we had not yet known would be so beautifully fulfilled. The attic was just as we had left it, a chaotic but organized landscape of neatly labeled boxes. I found the box marked photos, and sat down on an old trunk, the air thick with the nostalgic scent of dust and old paper. But as I went to open it, my eyes were drawn to a different object, something that was glaringly, jarringly out of place. Leaning against a stack of old suitcases was a large cardboard tube, the kind used for carrying architectural drawings. It was new, the cardboard still crisp and clean. It was not one of ours. Michael had been an engineer, not an architect, and his blueprints had all been digitized years ago. This was new, and it was here, in this dusty, forgotten corner of the house, as if it had been deliberately hidden. A cold, prickling curiosity, the kind that feels more like a premonition, washed over me. I picked up the tube. It was unlabeled. I pulled off the plastic cap and slid out the contents. It was a thick, tightly rolled sheaf of professional-grade paper. I unrolled the first sheet on the dusty attic floor. My breath caught in my throat. It was a blueprint, a detailed professional, architectural drawing of my house. But it was not my house as it was my house as it could be. It was a plan for a massive top-to-bottom renovation. My first thought was one of confusion, not alarm. Was this something Michael had been planning before he died? A surprise he had never gotten to share with me. But the date in the corner of the drawing immediately dispelled that notion. The plans were dated just 2 months ago. I unrolled the next sheet. It was a floor plan for the main level. The changes were dramatic. My traditional warm kitchen was to be gutted, replaced by a sleek, minimalist open-concept space with a massive chef's island. My cozy, book-lined living room was to have a wall knocked down, creating a cavernous great room that flowed into a new, expanded dining area. My personal touches, my antiques, the very soul of the home I had created were to be erased, replaced by a cold, modern, and utterly impersonal aesthetic. It was Angela's taste all over my house. A new, sharper, and more unpleasant feeling began to take root in my heart. This was not a surprise Michael had been planning. This was a secret Angela and Damon were planning. They were redesigning my home, without my knowledge, without my consent. But it was the final sheet, the floor plan for the first floor, my floor that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. My private suite, my sanctuary, my small self-contained world, was to be completely demolished. The plans showed the walls knocked down, the space reconfigured into 2 new rooms. The first was labeled Home Gym. The second, with a crib and a changing table drawn in perfect architectural detail, was labeled Nursery. They were planning for a baby I had not been told about, a baby they were planning to raise in a room that was currently my bedroom. My eyes frantically scanned the rest of the plans, searching for my own name, for my own relocated space. I found it in the basement. A small windowless storage room at the back of the basement. A space that was currently filled with old paint cans and Christmas decorations, had a new label. The label in small, neat, and utterly devastating letters read, "Storage Patricia's Suite." I stared at the words, at the cold hard architectural evidence of my own erasure, and a feeling of profound soul-deep violation washed over me. This was not just a renovation, this was a coup. This was a blueprint for a quiet, methodical, and utterly ruthless takeover of my home and my life. They were not just redesigning the house, they were redesigning my role within it. I was to be moved from the principal's office to the janitor's closet in the basement. I carefully, meticulously, rolled the blueprints back up and placed them back in their tube. I put the tube back exactly where I had found it. A silent, terrible secret in the dusty, quiet attic. The ghost in this house was not my late husband. It was me, and I had just discovered the plans for my own exorcism. The peace of my solitary week was shattered. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battleground, and I had just been given a glimpse of the enemy's plans. The week of blessed, solitary peace came to an abrupt end with the return of Angela and Damon. They swept back into the house on a wave of loud, self-important energy. Their skin tanned from the Miami sun, their arms laden with shopping bags from a dozen expensive boutiques. They were full of stories of their business meetings. Stories that were a thin, transparent veneer over what had clearly been a week of pure, unadulterated hedonism. I greeted them with a quiet, polite warmth, my face a carefully constructed mask of maternal welcome. The blueprints in the attic, the cold, hard proof of their betrayal, were a toxic secret that I now had to carry. I had to play my part, the role of the quiet, slightly dotty and completely oblivious mother, while I decided on my next move. The high school principal in me, the woman who had dealt with 1,000 devious misbehaving teenagers, knew that a direct confrontation without a fully formed strategy was a losing game. I needed more information. I needed to understand the full scope of their plot. That evening I got it. I had retired to my suite early, pleading a headache, a common and believable ailment for a woman of my age. But I was not resting. I was waiting, a silent, patient hunter in the darkness of my own home. I left the door to my suite slightly ajar, a tiny crack that was just wide enough for sound to travel. At around 11 o'clock, long after they thought I had gone to bed, I heard their voices from the kitchen. They were low, conspiratorial, the sound of two people who believed they were completely and safely alone. I slipped out of my bed, my bare feet making no sound on the thick Persian rug. I crept to the door and listened. The trip was a success, Damon was saying, his voice a low, triumphant hum. The investors are practically begging us to take their money, but they want to see the plans finalized. They want to know the asset is secure. The asset? My house. I know, Angela replied, her voice a sharp, impatient hiss. But we have to be careful, Damon. We can't rush this. She's not a complete idiot. A small backhanded compliment that was, in itself, a profound insult. She's close enough, he scoffed. Did you see her this evening? She looks more tired, more fragile, every day. All we need is one more episode. Episode? My blood ran cold. I know, Angela said, a note of something that sounded almost like guilt in her voice, but it was quickly suppressed. I felt bad about hiding her car keys last week. She was so frantic. My car keys. They had gone missing last Tuesday. I had spent an hour in a state of rising, age-related panic, convinced I was losing my mind, before they had miraculously turned up in the sugar bowl in the kitchen cabinet, a place I would never ever have put them. I had dismissed it as a senior moment, a brain fog. It hadn't been a moment of confusion. It had been an act of deliberate, calculated gaslighting. They were not just waiting for me to decline, they were actively, secretly trying to manufacture my incompetence. It was for her own good, baby, Damon said. His voice a smooth, soothing poison. We have to build a case. A pattern of behavior, the failing memory, the episodes of confusion. It's the only way the lawyer will be able to make the argument. The lawyer. The specialist lawyer they were planning to see. Have you spoken to him again? Angela asked. I have a meeting with him on Friday, Damon confirmed. He's the best in the state at this kind of thing. Guardianship, conservatorship. He said as long as we have a documented pattern of her being unable to manage her own affairs, and a doctor who is willing to sign off, the judge will grant us power of attorney without a second thought. Power of attorney. The final legal and utterly devastating checkmate. They were planning to have me declared legally incompetent. They were planning to seize control of my home, my finances, my very life, and to do it under the benevolent guise of taking care of me. And then, Angela said, her voice a low, excited whisper, full of a greedy, triumphant light, we can finally execute the renovation, we can get this place ready for the baby, and we can start looking at some nice, comfortable, and very secure assisted living facilities for her own good, of course. The final, brutal piece of their plan was laid bare. The blueprints were not for a distant, hypothetical future. They were for the immediate one. They were planning to have a baby, to take my house, and to put me in a home. And they were going to do it all under the color of law, using my own perceived frailty, a frailty they were actively trying to create, as their primary weapon. I stood there in the darkness of the hallway, my hand clamped over my mouth to stifle the cry of pure, unadulterated horror that was rising in my throat. This was not just disrespect. This was not just entitlement. This was a conspiracy of a magnitude so monstrous, so evil that it took my breath away. They were not just trying to move me to the basement. They were trying to erase me from my own life. The quiet, weary, and long-suffering mother died in that dark hallway, and in her place the high school principal, the woman who had dealt with 1,000 devious, lying, and manipulative adolescents, was reborn. I was no longer a victim, I was an administrator, and I was about to expel my own children from the school of my life, with extreme prejudice. The next morning I rose at dawn just as I had every day for the past 40 years. But this morning was different. The quiet, contemplative ritual of my morning routine, the coffee, the newspaper, the view of my small, beautiful garden was not a source of peace. It was the calm, focused preparation of a general before a battle. The shock and horror of the previous night had solidified into a cold, hard, and utterly unyielding resolve. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to go on the offensive. I waited until I heard the sound of Damon's ridiculously expensive sports car roaring to life and speeding down the driveway, on its way to another business meeting at the golf course. I waited until I heard the shower in Angela's suite turn on, and then I made my move. I did not call my friends. I did not call my brother. An emotional response was a luxury I could not afford. I needed a strategist. I needed a weapon. I needed a lawyer. I went into my private suite and closed the door. I walked to the large built-in bookshelf that housed my collection of first-edition novels, a passion my late husband Michael and I had shared. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books until I found the one I was looking for, a worn, leather-bound copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I pulled it from the shelf. It was not just a book, it was a decoy. Behind it, set flush into the wall, was a small, hidden keypad. I typed in a short 4-digit code, the date of my wedding anniversary, and a section of the bookshelf swung inward with a quiet, satisfying click, revealing a small, hidden safe. Inside, among my personal papers and a few pieces of my mother's jewelry, was a small, black address book. It was Michael's old book, full of the names and numbers of the people he had trusted most in the world. I flipped through the pages until I found the name I was looking for. Harrison, Charles, attorney at law. Charles Harrison was more than just a lawyer. He had been Michael's best friend since childhood. His college roommate, the best man at our wedding. He was a lion of the Philadelphia legal community, a brilliant, old-school litigator with a mind as sharp as a razor and a reputation for a fierce, unwavering loyalty to his clients. And he was, I knew, fiercely, protectively, loyal to the memory of his best friend, and to me. I had not spoken to him since Michael's funeral, but I knew with an absolute certainty that he was the only ally I needed. I dialed the private number listed in the book. His secretary answered, her voice crisp and professional. Mr. Harrison's office. This is Patricia Vance calling for Charles, I said, my voice calm and firm. Please tell him it is a matter of the utmost personal urgency. There was a brief pause, and then Mr. Harrison's own voice, a deep, familiar, and instantly comforting baritone, came on the line. Patricia? My God, it's been too long. Is everything all right? No, Charles, I said, my voice quiet but steady. I'm afraid it's not. I need your help. I'm in a situation, a rather ugly one, and I need the best and most ruthless lawyer I know. You've come to the right place, he said, his voice losing all its friendly warmth and taking on the cool, focused tone of a man who has just been presented with a case. Tell me everything, and don't leave out a single detail. And so I told him. I told him about Angela and Damon moving in. I told him about the slow, creeping takeover of my home. I told him about the blueprints I had found in the attic. the quiet, architectural evidence of their plot to erase me, and I told him about the conversation I had overheard last night, the chilling casual discussion of my failing memory, of power of attorney, of the assisted living facility that was to be my final comfortable cage. He listened in a profound professional silence, a silence that seemed to grow heavier and more thunderous with every detail I revealed. He did not interrupt, he did not offer condolences, he simply absorbed the facts, the brilliant legal mind of his processing the data, building the case. When I had finished, the silence on his end of the line was a palpable living thing. I could almost feel his rage, a cold, controlled, and utterly lethal fury on behalf of his late friend and his vulnerable widow. The ungrateful, parasitic little, he began, his voice a low, dangerous growl, before he cut himself off, reining in his personal anger and reasserting his professional calm. "Okay, Patricia," he said, his voice now a cool, strategic hum. "I understand the situation completely, and I can tell you, with absolute certainty, that we are going to shut this down. Not just shut it down, we are going to dismantle it. We are going to build a legal fortress around you so high and so strong that those two will never be able to touch you or your assets ever again." A wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over me. I was no longer alone, I had a lion on my side. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice for the first time holding a flicker of something that felt like hope. "You," he said, his voice a firm, clear, and non-negotiable command, "are going to do nothing. You are going to continue to play your part. You are the sweet, slightly confused, and completely unsuspecting mother. You will not confront them. You will not let them know that you are aware of their plot. Your ignorance is our greatest weapon right now. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. "Good," he continued, the sound of his pen scratching on a legal pad in the background. "I, on the other hand, am going to be very busy. I am going to draft a set of documents that will render their entire pathetic little scheme completely and laughably moot. It's time to take the queen off the board, Patricia. It's time to put your most valuable asset permanently and irrevocably out of their reach." The strategy Mr. Harrison proposed was not a simple defensive maneuver. It was a preemptive strike of such elegant legal brutality that it took my breath away. It was a plan that would not just protect me but would render Angela and Damon's entire nefarious plot completely and humiliatingly pointless. "Their plan has 2 phases, he explained, his voice a calm, strategic hum over the phone a day later. We were in the middle of our second, more detailed war planning session. Phase 1 is to establish a pattern of your supposed incompetence, the forgotten appointments, the misplaced items, the episodes of confusion. Phase 2 is to use that manufactured evidence to petition a court for conservatorship, giving them power of attorney over your estate." "And the estate," I said, my voice a quiet, bitter thing, "is the house." "Precisely," he confirmed. "The house is the prize. It's a significant multi-million-dollar unmortgaged asset in one of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. They see it as their inheritance, and they are simply too impatient and too greedy to wait for it." "So how do we stop them?" I asked. "Can we prove they're lying, that they're the ones hiding my keys?" "We could try," he said, "but it would be a messy public," he said, she said, battle. "It would be a spectacle, and it would give them exactly what they want, a stage on which to perform their role as the concerned loving children of a declining mother. We are not going to give them that stage. We are going to do something much cleaner, and much more final." He paused, letting the dramatic weight of his next statement settle. "We are going to take the house off the table, permanently." I was confused. "What do you mean? Sell it?" The thought of selling the house, my home, was a painful one. "No, Patricia," he said, and I could almost hear the grim smile in his voice. "Something much better. We are going to transfer the ownership of the property out of your name and into an irrevocable trust." He began to explain the beautiful, simple, and utterly ironclad logic of the plan. An irrevocable trust is a legal entity that once created cannot be altered or dissolved. The assets placed within it are no longer the personal property of the individual. "We will create the Vance Family Heritage Trust," he explained. "You will transfer the deed of the brownstone into this trust. You will be named as the lifetime beneficiary, which gives you the absolute legal right to live and enjoy the property undisturbed, for the rest of your natural life. No one, and I mean no one, can remove you from that house ever." "And after I'm gone?" I asked. "That's the beauty of it," he said, his voice full of a quiet, triumphant satisfaction. "You will name a successor beneficiary, the entity that will inherit the property upon your passing, And that beneficiary will not be Angela. Who then? I asked, my mind racing. Anyone you want, he said. A university, a museum, a charitable foundation. We will gift the house in perpetuity to an institution that will preserve it, that will honor its history and your and Michael's legacy. I understood. The brilliance of the plan was breathtaking. The moment I signed those papers, the house would no longer be a part of my personal estate. It would, for all legal and financial purposes, cease to be mine. It would belong to the trust. So when Angela and Damon go to their shady lawyer, I said, the pieces clicking together with a satisfying metallic snap, when they file their petition to have me declared incompetent, the judge will look at your estate, Mr. Harrison finished, and he will see that your primary asset, the house, is not actually yours to control. It belongs to a trust. There is nothing for them to take. There is no financial incentive for a conservatorship. Their entire case, which is built on a foundation of greed, will have its foundation completely removed. The prize they are fighting for will have vanished into thin air. It was a legal checkmate. It would not just stop their plan, it would make it utterly laughably pointless. They could have me declared the Queen of England for all the good it would do them. They would never be able to touch the house. It's perfect, Charles, I whispered, a wave of profound, overwhelming admiration for my late husband's best friend washing over me. It's a fortress. It is, he agreed, and now we just need to get it built before the enemy arrives at the gates. I'll have the documents drafted by tomorrow. I'll need you to come to my office to sign them. We can have the deed transfer filed with the city by the end of the week, and I suggest you do it on a day when you have a plausible reason to be out of the house for a significant amount of time. A cold, hard smile touched my lips. I think, I said, that I have a series of very important and very long doctor's appointments to schedule for later this week. The 2 days leading up to the signing were a masterclass in quiet, domestic espionage. I played the part of the frail, slightly confused matriarch to perfection. I misplaced my reading glasses, only to have them found by a triumphant Angela in the refrigerator. I forgot about a lunch appointment with an old friend, a performance that earned me a look of shared pitying concern from my daughter and her husband. I was a brilliant actress and they were a rapt, unsuspecting audience. They were so busy collecting their false evidence of my decline that they were completely blind to the real powerful machinations happening just beneath the surface. On Thursday morning, the day of the doctor's appointments, I made a show of my frailty. I moved a little slower, my voice a little weaker. I have a long day of tests, I told Angela over breakfast, my voice a tired sigh. Dr. Matthews is sending me to a specialist. My memory, you know. Oh, Mom, don't worry, she said, her voice dripping with a false saccharine sympathy that was almost nauseating. We'll be right here when you get back. You just focus on taking care of yourself. It was the perfect cover. A day of medical appointments was a plausible and even expected event for a woman in my supposed condition. I left the house at 9 o'clock, but my taxi did not take me to a hospital. It took me to the heart of downtown Philadelphia, to the gleaming steel and glass tower that housed the offices of Harrison, Sterling, and Finch. Stepping into Mr. Harrison's office was like stepping into a different world, a world of quiet, mahogany-paneled power. He greeted me not with the condescending pity of my children, but with the warm, respectful embrace of an old and trusted friend. Patricia, he said, his eyes full of a fierce, protective loyalty, you're looking more formidable than ever. For the next 3 hours we were not a grieving widow and a sympathetic friend. We were two generals, finalizing the details of our strategy. He walked me through the trust documents, every clause, every subsection, his brilliant legal mind translating the dense formal language into a clear, simple blueprint for my own liberation. The Vance Family Heritage Trust was a work of legal art. It was an ironclad, impenetrable fortress. I signed the documents, my hand steady, my signature a firm, decisive stroke of a woman who was reclaiming her own life. With each page I signed, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, a weight I had been carrying for years without even realizing it. We then signed the deed transfer, the simple legal document that would officially move my home, my sanctuary, out of my personal name and into the protective custody of the trust. Mr. Harrison's paralegal immediately left to file the documents at City Hall. By the end of the business day, the transfer would be a matter of public record. The house would no longer be mine. It's done, he said, a quiet, profound satisfaction in his voice. The fortress is built. The Queen is safe. I felt a surge of emotion so powerful it almost took my breath away. It was a mixture of grief, of relief, of a fierce, triumphant sense of justice. "Thank you, Charles," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Michael would have been so grateful." "Michael," he said, his own voice now a low, affectionate rumble, "would have been so damn proud of you." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in years. The main part of the plan was executed, but there was one last stop to make, one final practical step to secure my fortress. My taxi took me to a small, unassuming storefront in a quiet part of the city. The sign above the door read, "A1 Lock and Key." I had an appointment. I had hired a 24-hour locksmith, the best and most discreet in the city. I explained the situation to the locksmith, a quiet, professional man with intelligent, understanding eyes. I did not give him the whole sordid story. I simply told him that I was an elderly woman living with family, and that for security and peace of mind, I needed to have the locks on my private residence changed immediately. "I can have a technician at your home at 7 o'clock this evening," he said. "He'll be in an unmarked van. He will be quick, quiet, and discreet." "Perfect," I said. I returned home late that afternoon, my performance of the exhausted post-medical test patient perfectly in place. Angela and Damon greeted me with their usual cloying concern, their eyes full of a new speculative light. They were wondering what the specialist had said, what new piece of evidence they could add to their growing case against me. I told them nothing, just that I was tired and needed to rest. I retreated to my suite, the quiet, beating heart of my new, legal fortress. And I waited for the evening to unfold. A quiet, patient general waiting for the enemy to walk into a trap they had no idea had even been set. The evening unfolded with the slow, tense rhythm of a play in its final act. I remained in my suite, a quiet, invisible presence, listening to the sounds of the house. I heard Angela and Damon in the kitchen, their voices a low conspiratorial murmur. They were likely discussing the day's events, my doctor's appointments, and how they could spin them to their advantage in their upcoming meeting with their specialist lawyer. They were plotting the final moves of a chess game in which I had already quietly and definitively declared checkmate. At precisely 7 o'clock, I heard the faint, almost inaudible sound of a vehicle pulling into the back alley behind my house. It was the locksmith arriving as promised, a ghost in an unmarked van. I had given him instructions to use the private back entrance to my suite, a door that was hidden from the main part of the house. He was a master of his craft, a silent, efficient professional. In less than 20 minutes, with a series of quiet, precise movements, he had replaced the locks on both the front and back doors of the brownstone. He handed me 2 new beautifully cut and wonderfully exclusively mine sets of keys. "It's done, ma'am," he whispered. "No other key will open these doors now." I paid him in cash and he disappeared as silently as he had arrived. The fortress was now secure. The trap was set. All that was left was for the first unsuspecting victim to walk into it. I didn't have to wait long. At around 8 o'clock I heard the familiar arrogant roar of Damon's sports car, as he pulled up to the front of the house. He had been at a business meeting, which I knew for a fact was his weekly poker game with his equally useless affluent friends. I went to the front window of my sitting room, a window that was partially obscured by a large leafy ficus tree, giving me a perfect hidden vantage point of the front steps. I watched as he got out of his car, whistling a tuneless, self-satisfied melody. He was a man without a care in the world, a man who believed he was on the verge of a great and unearned victory. He bounded up the front steps, his movements full of a confident proprietary swagger. This was his house, his kingdom. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his key. He slid it into the lock of the magnificent antique oak door, the door my husband had spent a month lovingly restoring years ago. And then he turned it, or rather, he tried to. I watched, a cold, quiet satisfaction settling over me, as his confident, easy movement was met with the hard, unyielding resistance of solid, high-grade steel. The key did not turn. He stopped, a look of mild, bovine confusion on his handsome face. He pulled the key out, looked at it as if it had personally offended him and slid it back into the lock. He tried again, with a little more force this time. Nothing. The confusion began to morph into frustration. He jiggled the key, a frantic, angry, and utterly useless motion. He grunted with effort, his knuckles white on the brass key. The lock, my new beautiful and exclusively mine lock, did not budge. "What the hell?" I heard him mutter, his voice a low, angry growl that carried through the thick glass of my window. He began to lose his composure. The cool, charming facade was beginning to crack, revealing the ugly, petulant child that lay just beneath the surface. He started to bang on the door, his open palm a loud, flat and increasingly frantic sound against the solid oak. "Patsy," he shouted, his voice a mixture of annoyance and a dawning, real anger. "Hey Patsy, open the door, something's wrong with the lock." I did not move, I did not answer. I simply stood at my window, a silent watching statue, and I let him bang. His calls grew louder, more furious. The name Patsy was now laced with a series of creative and thoroughly unflattering curses. The charming, successful son-in-law was gone, replaced by a red-faced, screaming man, locked out of a house he believed was his own. The banging escalated. He was now using his fist, a series of hard, thudding blows that echoed in the quiet, respectable street. "Open the damn door, you old bat," he screamed, his voice a raw, ugly and satisfying sound. The mask was completely off. The monster I had been living with for the past year was now on full public display, for all my quiet, respectable neighbors to see and hear. And the performance, I knew, was about to get a second, even more unhinged cast member. His phone was out, he was calling for reinforcements. The wail of a distant siren was a beautiful, calming sound, a promise of the quiet, bureaucratic order I had just summoned into our chaotic domestic war. Angela and Damon, however, did not hear it. They were too consumed by their own righteous theatrical fury. Damon had abandoned his assault on the door and was now pacing the top of the brownstone steps like a caged, furious animal, his earlier rage now curdled into a sullen, menacing silence. Angela, her crowbar still held in a white-knuckled grip, was staring at the door as if trying to set it on fire with the sheer venomous force of her will. They were a perfect, terrible pair, a portrait of modern, aggressive entitlement. Completely convinced of their own victimhood, utterly blind to the fact that they were the authors of their own predicament, they believed this was their house, their territory, and I was the irrational, senile intruder who had dared to challenge their authority. The police cruiser, when it arrived, did not use its siren or flashing lights. It glided to a quiet, discreet stop at the curb, a dark official presence in the gaslit twilight. 2 officers got out, their movements calm, professional, and radiating an aura of no-nonsense authority. They were not here to raid a den of criminals. They were here to mediate a dispute, and their expressions were a mixture of weariness and a kind of bored professional calm. The sight of the uniforms, however, did not have the calming effect I had anticipated. For Angela and Damon, it was not a sign to de-escalate. It was an opportunity, it was the arrival of a new audience for their performance. "Officers, thank God you're here," Angela cried, her voice instantly transforming from a furious low growl to a high, frantic and genuinely distressed wail. She dropped the crowbar, which clattered loudly on the stone steps, and rushed toward them, her face a perfect mask of a terrified, concerned daughter. "It's our mother, we think she's having some kind of episode." Damon, taking his cue from his wife, immediately chimed in, his face a picture of grave masculine concern. "We're so worried, officers," he said, his voice a low, reasonable hum. "She's been not herself lately, confused, paranoid, and now she's locked us out of our own house. We're just trying to get in to make sure she's okay." It was a brilliant, despicable performance. They were painting me as the crazy, dangerous one, the senile old woman who had barricaded herself in the house, a danger to herself and others. They were trying to recruit the police as their allies, as the strong arms that would break down the door and help them rescue their poor, confused mother. The 2 officers, a seasoned, older man and a younger, sharp-eyed woman, listened to this torrent of concerned lies with impassive, unreadable expressions. They had seen this all before. The bitter, ugly dramas of family life were their daily bread. "Okay, sir, ma'am," the older officer said, his voice a calm, authoritative rumble. "Why don't you just calm down? Let's find out what's going on." He walked to the bottom of the steps and looked up at the house. "Is there a number we can call to speak with your mother?" "We've tried," Angela insisted, her voice breaking with a beautifully feigned sob. "She's not answering. We're so afraid she might have fallen, or—" The lie was so smooth, so convincing, that for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I almost believed it myself. But I had my own script to follow. At that moment, a new sound entered the scene, a sound that was as quiet, as elegant, and as disruptive as a chess master entering a game of checkers. It was the sound of a sleek, black town car gliding to a silent, perfect stop at the curb, directly behind the police cruiser. The back door opened, and Mr. Charles Harrison stepped out. He was a vision of old-school establishment power. His 3-piece charcoal gray suit was impeccable. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed. His polished English leather shoes gleamed under the gaslights. He carried a slim, expensive-looking leather briefcase. He was not just a lawyer, he was the law in its most civilized, most formidable, and most expensive form. He surveyed the scene. The two hysterical adults, the crowbar on the steps, the two police officers, the dark, silent house, and his expression did not flicker. He was a lion, stepping into a squabble of hyenas, and he was here to restore order. Mr. Harrison's arrival was a silent, powerful bomb that detonated in the middle of Angela and Damon's carefully constructed performance. The entire dynamic of the confrontation shifted in an instant. The police officers who had been looking at my children with a kind of weary professional skepticism now stood a little straighter, their expressions shifting to one of respectful, cautious deference. This was no longer just a messy domestic dispute. This was something else entirely. Angela and Damon stared at the elegant, imposing figure walking toward them, their frantic theatrical performance faltering. They did not know who he was, but they instinctively primally understood that he was a man of a power and a status far beyond their own. He was a player from a different league, and he had just stepped onto their field. "Good evening, officers," Mr. Harrison said, his voice a calm, authoritative counterpoint to the high-pitched, hysterical energy of the scene. He gave a slight, respectful nod to the two officers before turning his cool, appraising gaze on my daughter and son-in-law. "A lovely evening for a bit of amateur demolition, isn't it?" The question was a soft, silken, and utterly devastating insult. The crowbar, still lying on the steps, seemed to gleam with a new, incriminating light. "Who are you?" Angela demanded, her voice a mixture of her usual aggressive bluster and a new, unfamiliar note of uncertainty. "My name is Charles Harrison," he said simply, "and I am legal counsel for the owner of this property." He turned his full, undivided attention to the two of them, his eyes as cold and as hard as a judge's gavel. "Which, I'm afraid," he continued, his voice a quiet, merciless blade, "is no longer you, nor is it your mother individually." The confusion on their faces was a beautiful, terrible thing to behold. They had no idea what he was talking about. Their entire simple, greedy worldview was predicated on a single, linear idea. Mom owns the house, we are the children, therefore the house is ours. The concept of a third legal entity was a complexity their minds could not and would not compute. Mr. Harrison did not wait for them to process. He was not here to educate, he was here to execute. He placed his slim, leather briefcase on the hood of the police cruiser and opened it with a series of quiet, efficient clicks. He removed a single thick and markedly official-looking document. "As of 3 p.m. this past Thursday," he announced, his voice ringing with the clear, irrefutable authority of the law, "the deed for this property, 1842 Delancey Place, was officially and irrevocably transferred. The new owner of record is a legal entity known as the Vance Family Heritage Trust." He held up the document, the fresh red seal of the city's records office a glaring, damning starburst at the bottom of the page. He handed it not to Angela and Damon, but to the older of the two police officers. "I believe you'll find everything is in order, officer," he said. The officer took the document and began to read it, his face a mask of professional concentration. Mr. Harrison turned his attention back to my children, who were now staring at him with the wide, blank, uncomprehending eyes of two people who have just been told that the sky is in fact green. "The trust," Mr. Harrison continued, a patient, almost bored teacher explaining a simple concept to a pair of very slow students, "was established by my client, Patricia Vance. She is the lifetime beneficiary, which grants her the sole and absolute right to reside in the property undisturbed, but she is not the owner. The trust is the owner." He let that sink in, a beautiful, legal, and utterly inescapable checkmate. "So you see," he concluded, a thin, cold smile touching his lips, "you are not in fact locked out of your house. You are attempting to forcibly and illegally enter a property that you have absolutely no legal claim to, a property, I might add," he said, his gaze flicking to the crowbar, "that you were just about to vandalize." The legal reality of their situation, in all its stark, cold, and brutal clarity, had finally crashed down upon them. They were not the wronged children. They were not the concerned caretakers. They were, in the cold, hard eyes of the law, nothing more than a pair of common trespassers, and they had just been caught, red-handed by the most expensive lawyer in the city. The game was over, and they had lost. The police officer finished reading the deed, his expression now one of cool professional clarity. The messy he said she said domestic dispute had just been rendered beautifully legally simple. This was no longer a family matter. This was a property matter, and the ownership of that property was no longer in question. He handed the document back to Mr. Harrison with a respectful nod. The paperwork seems to be in order, Counselor, he said. He then turned his full and now considerably less sympathetic attention to Angela and Damon. Sir, ma'am, he said, his voice the flat, official monotone of a man who is simply doing his job. As you do not reside here, and you have no legal claim to this property, you are at this moment trespassing. Trespassing? Angela shrieked. A last, desperate and utterly futile burst of her old indignant rage. We live here. Our clothes, our furniture, everything is in there. No, my dear, I believe you are mistaken, Mr. Harrison interjected, his voice as smooth and as cool as silk. He reached back into his briefcase and produced another document. What you were in fact, were guests. Guests in your mother's home. In your invitation as of 7 o'clock this evening was permanently and irrevocably revoked. He then did a thing of such beautiful theatrical and legally sound cruelty that I almost applauded from my hidden window. He served them. He stepped forward and handed the document, a formal notarized notice of trespass, directly into Angela's trembling hand. This document, he explained, for the benefit of the officers, formally notifies Mr. and Mrs. Peterson that they are no longer welcome on this property. Any attempt to remain or to return will be met with immediate legal action. The final legal nail had been hammered into the coffin of their entitlement. They had no rights here. They had no power. They were, in the eyes of the law, no different from any other stranger on the street. Now, officers, Mr. Harrison said, turning back to the police, his voice now one of quiet, reasonable cooperation. My client, Mrs. Vance, who is inside, is an elderly woman. She has been made to feel quite threatened and unsafe this evening by this aggressive demonstration. He gestured again to the crowbar. She has no desire to press charges for the attempted breaking and entering at this time. All she desires is for these two individuals to leave her property. Immediately, the older officer nodded. He had his script now. The situation was clear. All right, you heard the man, he said to Angela and Damon, his voice now devoid of any pretense of mediation. It was a command. You need to leave the premises. But our things, Damon stammered, a pathetic last-ditch attempt to find a foothold in his crumbling reality. We can't just leave our things. That, Mr. Harrison said, his voice a cool, final verdict, is a civil matter that you can feel free to discuss with me at a later date. Through your own legal counsel, of course. For tonight, however, your only concern is removing your persons from this property. The younger officer, who had been silent up to this point, finally spoke. We can give you 15 minutes, she said, her voice a sharp, no-nonsense thing. You can arrange for a ride. After that, if you are still on this property, you will be arrested for defiant trespass. Is that clear? 15 minutes. A ticking clock on the complete and total implosion of their lives. 15 minutes to arrange an exit from the home they had tried to conquer, from the life they had so arrogantly believed was theirs. The reality was a brutal physical blow. Angela stared at the officer, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. The fight was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly, and immensely satisfying spectacle of her own unconditional surrender. They were being evicted. Not by a distant, faceless bank, but by their own mother in the most public, most humiliating and most legally ironclad way imaginable. The final 15 minutes of their reign in my home were a symphony of quiet, frantic and satisfying humiliation. The police officers stood at the bottom of the steps, their arms crossed, their presence a silent, authoritative clock. Mr. Harrison remained at the top of the steps, a calm, victorious general overseeing the retreat of the vanquished army. Angela and Damon, who had once moved through this neighborhood with the confident swagger of landed gentry, were now reduced to two pathetic huddled figures on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the cold, unforgiving glow of their cell phones. Their frantic whispered calls were a desperate, futile attempt to find a soft landing place in a world that had suddenly become very hard. No, I know it's late. But, no, it's not a joke. We just need a place to stay for the night. I could imagine the conversations on the other end of the line. The confusion. The disbelief. The polite but firm refusals. No one wants to welcome a domestic dispute, especially one involving a crowbar and the police, into their home at 10 o'clock at night. Their friends, the ones they had so eagerly entertained in my home, the ones who had benefited from their performative generosity, were now in their moment of true need, mysteriously universally unavailable. The final, most humiliating call was the one they had to make to a taxi service. Angela, a woman who was used to being chauffeured in luxury vehicles, was forced to stand on the curb of her own childhood street and humbly request a ride, like any other common carless citizen. As they waited, a new, more intimate form of humiliation began. The neighbors, the quiet, respectable and gossipy residents of our historic Philadelphia street. Lights had been flickering on in the surrounding brownstones since the moment the shouting had begun. Now curtains were being discreetly and then not so discreetly pulled back. Faces were appearing in the windows, silhouetted, watching figures in the quiet domestic theater of our street. They were watching as Angela and Damon, the glamorous, successful young couple who had moved in to take care of the poor, widowed Patricia, were now standing on the sidewalk, under the watchful eyes of two police officers, having a quiet, furious and truly desperate argument. The narrative they had so carefully constructed for the outside world was imploding in real time for all to see. When the taxi finally arrived, a beat-up, yellow sedan that was the very antithesis of their usual mode of transportation, the final pathetic act of their retreat began. They got in, their movements stiff with shame and rage. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Angela looked back at the house one last time, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was not a look of remorse. It was not a look of sadness. It was the look of a defeated tyrant, vowing a silent, futile revenge. I watched until the taillights of the taxi had disappeared around the corner, and then, they were gone. The police officers had a final quiet word with Mr. Harrison, who thanked them for their professionalism. They got back in their cruiser and drove away. The quiet, orderly peace of the neighborhood restored. Mr. Harrison walked to the front door, where I was now waiting, the door open, the warm golden light of my home spilling out onto the steps. He looked at me, a slow, tired and satisfied smile on his face. "Well, Patricia," he said, his voice a low, triumphant rumble, "I believe the castle has been secured." I smiled back, a genuine, heartfelt smile of profound, overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you, Charles," I said, my voice a little shaky. "Thank you for everything." "It was my honor," he said, "and my pleasure." He did not come in. He knew I needed to be alone. He simply squeezed my hand, a gesture of old steadfast friendship, and walked back to his waiting town car. I closed the magnificent antique oak door, the door my daughter had been about to deface with a crowbar. I engaged the new solid and beautifully exclusively mine deadbolt. The sound was a deep, satisfying and final thunk. I stood in the silent, empty hallway of my home. My home. For the first time in a year, it was truly, completely and peacefully my own. The reign of entitlement was over. The uneasy coexistence was over. The war was over, and I, the quiet, underestimated and now completely victorious queen, was finally, blessedly alone in her reclaimed kingdom. The immediate explosive drama of the eviction was followed by the slow, grinding and immensely satisfying reality of the financial fallout. Angela and Damon had built their entire glamorous life on a single fragile foundation, their ability to live rent-free in my multi-million-dollar home. With that foundation violently and publicly removed, their entire carefully constructed world began to crumble with a speed that was almost comical. They had been what is known as house rich and cash poor, except they weren't even house rich. They were simply cash poor. Their combined incomes, which were respectable on paper, were nowhere near enough to sustain the lavish, debt-fueled lifestyle they had been living. The mortgage-sized rent payment they had been saving each month by living with me had not gone into savings or investments. It had gone to car leases, to designer clothes, to expensive dinners, to the constant, relentless upkeep of their fraudulent performance of wealth. Now suddenly they were faced with the brutal, unforgiving reality of the Philadelphia rental market. They were forced to abandon their dreams of taking over my grand historic brownstone and instead had to find a small two-bedroom apartment in a modern, soulless complex on the far side of town, a place with thin walls and a view of a parking lot. The rent, I knew from a cursory search online, was astronomical, a monthly four-figure bill they had never in their adult lives had to account for. The consequences were swift and brutal. The first casualty was Damon's ridiculously expensive sports car. The lease payment, which was more than the mortgage on my first house, was a luxury they could no longer afford. The car was returned, and Damon was now the proud driver of a 5-year-old, sensible and supremely humiliating sedan. Next came their credit card debt. They had been living on plastic, a constant revolving door of minimum payments and balance transfers. Now, with a massive new rent payment eating up a huge chunk of their income, even the minimums became a struggle. The angry red-lettered notices began to arrive. The harassing phone calls from collection agencies started. The world of easy credit, which had been their personal playground, had become a prison of high interest rates and relentless, unforgiving demands. Their lifestyle of illusion evaporated overnight. The expensive dinners at places like Lucille were replaced by takeout pizza and arguments over the grocery bill. The shopping sprees at high-end boutiques were replaced by tense, miserable trips to Target. The glamorous, carefree couple who had once been the toast of their social circle were now a stressed, broke, and unhappy pair, drowning in a sea of their own making. And the financial strain, as it always does, exposed the deep, rotten cracks in the foundation of their relationship. Their marriage had been a business partnership, a merger of her ambition and his charm, with my house as their primary, unlisted asset. Now that the asset was gone, the partnership was bankrupt. The arguments I heard through the family grapevine, a source I did not seek out but could not entirely avoid, were epic. They were loud, bitter, and full of a toxic, resentful blame. Angela blamed Damon for his laziness, for his failed developments, for his inability to be the powerful, wealthy man he had always pretended to be. Damon blamed Angela for her insatiable materialistic desires, for her constant, relentless pressure to live a life they could not afford, for her disastrous, aggressive confrontation with me that had led to their ruin. They were two profoundly selfish, entitled people who had been united by a common, greedy goal. Now that the goal was gone, they had nothing left in common but their shared miserable failure. They had been a team when they were robbing the bank. Now that the vault was empty, they were just two criminals, turning on each other in the getaway car. I felt no satisfaction in this. I felt no joy in their misery. I simply felt a kind of quiet, clinical, and weary sense of inevitability. This was the natural, logical, and unavoidable consequence of the choices they had made. This was the bill finally coming due. The months that followed were a period of quiet, joyful, and immensely satisfying reconstruction. My house, which had for so long felt like a contested, occupied territory, was finally completely mine again. The silence was no longer a lonely, echoing void. It was a beautiful, peaceful canvas on which I could now paint the final, masterpiece chapter of my own life. My first act of reclamation was to hire a team of carpenters and painters. I walked them through the house, my own original blueprints in hand, and I began the process of erasing the last lingering ghosts of my daughter's invasion. The sleek, uncomfortable, and soulless furniture they had left behind in their hasty retreat was donated to a local charity. The walls they had painted a cold, sterile white were repainted in the warm, rich colors I had always loved. And then I began my greatest project. I stood in the doorway of what had been Angela and Damon's master suite, the room they had so arrogantly claimed as their own. It was a beautiful, light-filled space, but it was tainted with the memory of their entitlement. I would not sleep there. I would transform it. I decided to turn the entire suite into a library. My library. A place for my books, for my thoughts, for the quiet intellectual pursuits I had so long deferred. The carpenters built floor-to-ceiling bookshelves of rich, dark cherry wood. I spent a blissful week unpacking my first editions, arranging them not by a decorator's sense of color but by the logic of history and the love of a lifetime of reading. My husband's old velvet armchair, which had been so disrespectfully relegated to a dark corner, was given the place of honor by the large bay window overlooking the garden. The room was no longer a bedroom, a space of conflict and entitlement. It was a sanctuary of the mind, a testament to a life of quiet, intellectual passion. It was a foundation of my own making. One cool spring afternoon, as I was sitting in my new library, a letter arrived. It was from Angela. It was the first direct communication I had received from her since that terrible night. My hand was steady as I opened it. The letter was not the apology I had perhaps, in some small, foolish maternal corner of my heart, hoped for. It was a long, rambling, and profoundly self-pitying screed. It was full of blame for me, for Damon, for the unfairness of the world. It was the letter of a woman who had learned nothing, who was still in her heart the victim of her own story. But at the very end, there was a single, small, and almost imperceptible crack in the wall of her narcissism. A single desperate and half-hearted sentence. I guess I'm sorry for some of it. I read the letter and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a kind of quiet, final, and profoundly liberating indifference. She was a project I was no longer managing. A building whose structural flaws were no longer my responsibility. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer in my desk, a final, unanswered piece of correspondence in a file that was now permanently closed. My final act of liberation was a legal one. I called Mr. Harrison. "Charles," I said, "I want to talk about the trust, about the future of the house." A week later we were at a meeting with the Philadelphia Historical Society. My brownstone, a beautiful example of 19th century architecture, was a building of historical significance. I had the paperwork drawn up. I made a significant donation to the society, and I officially legally designated my home as a protected city landmark. The designation meant that the house could never be significantly altered. Its facade, its interior architectural details, its very soul were now protected by law, in perpetuity, and in the final clause of the trust, I had it stipulated that upon my passing the house would not be sold. It would be gifted in its entirety to the Historical Society to be preserved and used as a small museum and a center for architectural study. The house, the asset my children had seen as a simple transactional prize to be seized and liquidated, was now forever a gift to the city, a legacy for the public. It was a final, quiet, and immensely satisfying checkmate. I had not just protected my home, I had transformed it. I had turned their selfish, greedy, and destructive plot into an opportunity for a final, beautiful, and truly meaningful act of public generosity. I had, in the end, built a new foundation not for my family, but for my community, and it was a foundation that would last forever. Thank you for watching.